Nick wasn't sure what first gave him the courage to run. Perhaps it was the half-eaten dinner that still sat cold on the dining table, a silent reminder of everything wrong in that house. Maybe it was his father's word scroll, sharp and never apologetic, that echoed in his mind like a toxic mantra. Or could it have been the final raised hand, the stinging slap that landed too close to his swollen eye? Whatever triggered it, 15-year-old Nick found himself standing in the middle of his small bedroom that night, tears burning hot, stuffing clothes into a worn-out backpack. He left behind his mother's memory in the threadbare quilt she had made, a handful of battered children's books, and an echoing emptiness that had replaced what once was a semblance of a family. He slipped out of the house beneath the cover of darkness, the old screen door squeaking accusingly behind him. Nick paused just for a moment, half expecting anyone to call out and stop him, to beg him to stay. But when no such words arrived, he took a deep breath of the crisp night air and walked away from his old life. The unlit street was almost as cold as his father's glare. Cracked sidewalks guided his uncertain steps, each footstep on the concrete an oddly liberating sound. He wasn't sure where he was heading, only that anywhere was better than this place. Nick walked fast, half jogging through a neighborhood silent with the hush of midnight. At the end of the road, he stopped beneath a flickering street lamp. The battered old duffel on his shoulders felt heavier than all the regrets in his chest. He pulled it higher, stepping away from the orange glow of the light, as though it might reveal him to some passing neighbor, as though it might pull him back to the place he'd just left. He had turned 16 2 weeks ago, not that anyone in the house had celebrated. If he had ever needed reassurance that he was alone, his birthday had provided it. There were no gifts, no card, no mention of it at all. Just another day of tense silence, a half-cold supper, and an argument that had ended with him stumbling into his room, tears on his cheeks, stifling the sob that threatened to rip him apart. By the next morning, he had quietly decided that if the people who shared his home wouldn't even acknowledge his existence, then perhaps it was time he found somewhere he did matter. Fear churned in his stomach, yet excitement fluttered around the edges of his thoughts. He was free, wasn't he? Free from the daily insults that rolled off his father's tongue, from the swigging bottle on the coffee table, from the stench of stale smoke that choked every room. He was free to find a better life, one he wasn't sure existed, but one he had to believe was out there. Still, freedom came with a price. As he walked deeper into the night, Nick's heart began to hammer harder with each unfamiliar street and shadowy corner. He could taste the fear in his throat. He hadn't planned beyond running away. Survival had never been discussed in any of his classes. He took the local bus downtown before dawn, fumbling for change from the pocket of his jeans, conscious of the driver's suspicious glance. Most people at that hour were heading off to early shifts or traveling home from late-night jobs, not wandering aimlessly as he was. The rumble of the engine lulled Nick, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. He kept his eyes on his sneakers, not wanting to draw attention to himself. The dusty seats smelled of stale coffee and the faint odor of gasoline. Someone coughed near the back. A child fussed in the aisle seat across from him. Nick's throat felt tight as he watched that child's mother cradle him gently, whispering something in his ear. He turned away, blinking at the darkness outside. He'd never known that kind of affection. His mother had died when he was 8, and he could barely recall the warm press of her lips on his forehead, or the comforting scent of lavender that trailed after her. But there was a buried recollection somewhere, her laughter floating through the kitchen, her hands tucking him into bed. He clung to the fragment of her voice, remembering how she had once told him that kindness was all that mattered in the world, kindness and love. That memory tightened in his chest. He almost smiled. By the time the bus rattled to a stop in the heart of the city, Nick was exhausted. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky a tentative gold that promised a new day. He dropped down onto the sidewalk, wrinkling his nose at the acrid smell of car exhaust, stale cigarettes, and rotting garbage wafting from a nearby dumpster. The city was already rumbling with life news. Nick paused by a small park. Birds were stirring in the trees above as early commuters hurried by. He sank onto a bench and tried not to look like someone with nowhere to go. The surge of pride he'd felt upon leaving began to ebb, replaced by a stabbing awareness of just how alone he was. People rushed past without a second glance, businessmen with polished briefcases, women tapping hurriedly on their phones. He was invisible, but at least here no one was telling him he was worthless. An ache gnawed at his stomach. He hadn't eaten since midday yesterday and rummaged through his backpack to find a squashed bag of crackers. He ate them slowly, each bite echoing in the emptiness of his gut. He wouldn't let himself cry. He was out. He was alive. He would survive. As the sun rose higher, he told himself he'd find a way forward, some kind of shelter, maybe a job that wouldn't ask too many questions. He brushed crumbs from his jeans, picked up his bag, and began to walk again, not sure exactly where his feet were taking him. He only knew he couldn't stop. Middle. Nick learned quickly that the city could swallow a person whole. Tall buildings loomed over him like silent judges as he wandered through blocks of gray concrete. Hunger became a persistent demon gnawing at his sides, and the meager money in his pocket began to dwindle. He slept on benches, under overpasses, and sometimes crouched in the doorways of abandoned storefronts. Each morning, he'd wake stiff and cold, determined to find something better. Time blurred. Days passed in a haze of half-eaten pastries scavenged from bakery dumpsters and watery coffee bought at convenience stores. The occasional kind stranger might leave $1 on his lap when he dozed at a park bench. More often than not, people pretended he didn't exist. In those first few weeks, he didn't speak to anyone for more than a minute or two. He felt like a ghost. One night, while searching for a dry spot away from a sudden downpour, Nick found himself in front of a library. Through the glass doors, he saw warm light and rows of chairs. A sign declared it was open for another 2 hours, so he slipped inside, grateful for a reprieve from the cold. The space smelled of ink, old paper, and a faint trace of lemon cleaning solution. He moved around quietly, trailing his fingertips along the spines of books on the shelves, letting them bring back a small sense of comfort he'd once found in reading. An older librarian glanced at him and offered a polite smile, but said nothing. Nick nodded in return, unsure if he was permitted to stay. He settled at a wooden table with a pile of books. When closing time approached, the library began to empty. Nick felt a spike of anxiety. He had nowhere safe to go. As he stood to leave, the older librarian approached him. She had warm hazel eyes and wore a name tag that read, Mrs. Fletcher. "Son, it's nearly closing," she said, her voice gentle. Nick frowned and nodded. No. I was just leaving." Mrs. Fletcher's gaze flicked to his rumpled backpack, the dark circles under his eyes. She offered a sympathetic smile. "We open again at 9 tomorrow. You're welcome back then." He mumbled a quiet thanks and slipped out into the rainy night. The wind whipped cold water across his cheeks, soaking his thin hoodie. Desperation clutched his heart. Without a plan, he was at the mercy of the world. Part of him was tempted to hitch a ride to the next city, but he couldn't even manage bus fare at this point. He trudged through puddles, water squelching in his shoes, until at last he found shelter in a covered alley next to a small diner. There, he huddled behind a trash bin. The stench was terrible, but it was dry. He dozed fitfully, hearing the patter of rain drip down the gutters until dawn came to pry his eyes open. The next morning, as exhaustion settled into his bones, Nick tried something he'd never done. While wandering the same block, stomach growling painfully, he noticed a diner's back door propped open. A cook in a flour-dusted apron rushed inside, leaving a tray of fresh bread to cool on a rack just beside the door. The smell was heavenly. Nick's gaze darted nervously around. His conscience churned, but hunger was a cruel master. In a swift motion, he reached for a small loaf and slid it into his backpack. His heart pounded as he fled, not stopping until he turned a corner. He squatted behind a row of parked cars and tore off pieces of bread with trembling hands. Guilt and relief mingled on his tongue along with the warm yeast flavor. He promised himself he wouldn't do that again, that it was only this once. When he finished, there was a pang of shame, but also a renewed determination to find a better way. He hated sinking to this level. His mother had raised him differently. That evening, Nick went back to the library. It had become a small sanctuary safe, quiet and dry. He spent the hours before closing reading job listings in local classifieds, searching for anything that didn't require an address or an ID he no longer kept. What little money he had was nearly gone. He was so absorbed in scanning the columns for dishwasher openings or manual labor that he barely noticed the figure who walked up behind him. "You know, it's almost impossible to get hired without references," said a low male voice. Nick jumped, turning. Standing there was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses perched on a broad nose. He wore a light jacket despite the chill outside and held a stack of old newspapers under one arm. Just looking," Nick stammered, shutting the classifieds. He wasn't sure if this was someone who would report him for loitering. The man offered a kind smile. "Didn't mean to startle you. It's just... I've been watching you flip through these for the past half hour. You look serious about finding something." Nick bristled slightly, ready to defend himself from a lecture he didn't ask for. But something in the man's gaze was different from the usual judgment. There was compassion there, and maybe a quiet sadness. Yeah, I just need a job." The man nodded, setting his newspapers down on the table. "I'm Martin Langley," he said, holding out a hand. Nick hesitated. He hadn't shaken anyone's hand in a very long time. But Martin's eyes were honest, inviting, so Nick gripped his palm and mumbled, "Nick, that's a good, strong name," Martin replied warmly. "I run a small workshop downtown. I fix antiques and make custom furniture. It's not a booming business, mind you, but it's mine." His gaze flickered to Nick's fraying jacket. "Would you want to come by tomorrow and see if you can help out? I can't offer much in terms of pay enough for a couple meals a day and maybe some new clothes, but it's honest work." Nick's heartbeat roared in his ears. He tried to read Martin's expression, searching for any hint of a trap. Could a stranger really be this kind? He reminded himself to stay cautious. "You don't even know me," Nick said quietly. "I've known a lot of people," Martin answered with a small, sad shrug. "Sometimes you just get a feeling, and I think you could use a chance." Nick swallowed hard, pressing his lips together. Did Martin see right through him that he was homeless, lonely, and desperate? Probably. But if this was some odd stroke of luck, maybe he shouldn't. "Let's say 10 in the morning, Martin replied, scribbling an address onto a scrap of paper and sliding it toward Nick. "Take the number 3 bus from the station near here. Ride it about 15 minutes and hop off at Gardner Street." Nick nodded again, carefully folding the paper. He braced himself, half expecting Martin to ask more questions or demand something in return. But Martin just picked up his newspapers and turned to leave, offering one last encouraging look. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it. Sanding furniture can be hard on the arms." After Martin left, Nick remained seated at the table for a long while, heart pounding. A sliver of hope glimmered through the gloom of his life. Could a stranger's kindness really open a door to something better? He wanted to believe it, yet he was scared to hope. Fear of being tricked or used gnawed at him, but he clenched that scrap of paper in his hand like a lifeline. That night, he managed a restless sleep in the back of a church that left its doors open for the homeless. There, curled up on a pew, he wondered if Martin would show up the next day. He had encountered empty promises before people who said they'd help but never did. Still, the possibility was too precious to dismiss. Morning came, and Nick forced himself to ride the bus downtown. The rickety vehicle jostled him as he kept one hand curled around the note. Langley's workshop. It read in neat handwriting. His stomach twisted in knots of anticipation. When Nick stepped off at Gardner Street, the first thing he noticed was the strong smell of sawdust and varnish, drifting from a small, unassuming shop nestled between a laundromat and a bakery. The sign hanging above the door was carved from rich mahogany, proclaiming Langley's Workshop in simple lettering. Nick inhaled nervously and pushed open the door. Inside, the space was surprisingly large, with high ceilings crisscrossed by wooden beams. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto half-finished tables and chairs. The walls were lined with shelves holding all manner of tools planes, chisels, sandpaper, brushes, jars of stain. In the far corner, Martin was crouched beside a rocking chair, carefully stripping the old varnish with practiced strokes. He glanced up as Nick entered and smiled. "You made it. Good." Nick offered a hesitant nod, shifting from foot to foot. Yeah. Martin stood, wiping sawdust from his hands on a worn cloth. I was worried you might change your mind. I'm glad you decided to come. Nick shrugged. I didn't have anywhere else to be. He regretted his bluntness as soon as the words left his mouth, but Martin didn't seem offended. In fact, he just nodded with gentle understanding. Let's find you something to do, Martin said, taking Nick over to a long wooden workbench. He showed Nick the basics: how to sand evenly in the direction of the grain, how to clean off dust with a tack cloth. They worked side by side, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper and the scent of wood shavings oddly soothing. Every once in a while, Martin offered encouragement or gently corrected Nick's angle. For Nick, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment building in his chest each time he smoothed a rough edge into a silky surface. Midday, Martin handed Nick a lunch bag with a turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a bottle of water. At first, Nick refused. He didn't want to seem desperate, even though his stomach rumbled. But Martin just pressed it into his hands. Workers need to eat, he said simply, returning to his own meal. Nick devoured the sandwich. The taste nearly brought tears to his eyes. Real meat, crisp lettuce, a smear of mayonnaise. After weeks of living on scraps, it felt like a feast. By the end of the day, Nick's shoulders and arms ached from sanding, but a quiet pride throbbed in his chest. He had done something constructive. Martin handed him $20, and Nick stared at it like it was a precious gem. You can come back tomorrow if you'd like, Martin suggested, cleaning up the station. I could still use the help. Might even show you how to use the lathe if you're up for it. Nick looked up, meeting Martin's gaze. Really? You want me to come back? Martin smiled. I do, if you want to. Think on it. Nick hesitated. He didn't want to seem overly eager. His pride still stung from how low he'd had to stoop, but inside, relief rushed through him. Yeah, he finally managed. I'd like that. They locked up together. Before Nick left, Martin dug a key from his pocket and pressed it into Nick's palm. Key to the shop, he said simply. It's old, a spare. If you ever need a safe place to get off the street, you're welcome to come here. We have a small cot in the back I used to sleep on when I worked late nights. Nick's eyes widened. He parted his lips to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. After a moment, he swallowed hard and managed to shake. Martin's smile was tinged with something sad. Just don't lose it, he teased gently, then waved goodbye. Nick stared at the key in his hand for a long moment, wondering how one person's act of kindness could unravel so many knots inside him. In the weeks that followed, Nick slipped into a new routine. Each morning, he'd ride the bus, which Martin paid for by giving him extra change, to the workshop. He would sand pieces of furniture, watch Martin carve intricate details on table legs, or learn to apply finishes. Nick's awkwardness slowly eased as he settled into a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Over time, they spoke more. Nick was guarded at first, offering clipped answers about his past. Martin never pushed too hard, but sometimes he'd gently ask how Nick ended up on the streets. Nick would look away, muttering something vague about family trouble. Martin, for his part, revealed bits of his own story. He had once been married, though not anymore. He spoke briefly of a son, Tyler, who had passed away several years ago. Nick noticed the tremor in Martin's voice whenever Tyler was mentioned. It was the same tremor he felt when he tried to speak about his mother. One afternoon, Martin showed Nick a small frame on his office desk, a photo of a young boy smiling wide, arms around Martin's shoulders. He loved to build things, Martin said quietly, then set the photo face down again, as though it hurt too much to keep looking at it. On nights when Nick couldn't find a safe spot to sleep, he used the key Martin had given him and stayed at the workshop. Martin provided a blanket, and Nick curled up on the small cot behind the storage racks. It wasn't exactly luxurious, there was no shower, and the place smelled of sawdust, but it was warm, private, and free from fear of being robbed or assaulted. In exchange, Nick cleaned the floors, organized tools, and sometimes volunteered to run errands to the hardware store. Each evening when Martin left, Nick felt a pang of longing, as though part of him wished he could follow Martin home. Still, their arrangement felt fragile, balanced on Nick's unspoken secrets. He dreaded the day Martin might ask to meet his family or see his ID. Nick tried not to dwell on it. He told himself he'd save enough money for a small room somewhere, and maybe even get his GED. But these thoughts hovered on the edge of his mind like shy dreams not fully formed. Climax. One crisp autumn morning, Nick arrived at the workshop and found Martin on the phone, his voice raised in anger. Nick hovered by the door, feeling uneasy, until Martin noticed him and quickly ended the call. "Sorry," Martin said with a frustrated sigh, setting the phone down on the counter. "Family stuff." Nick nodded, but something in Martin's eyes hinted at deeper turmoil. He dropped his gaze, wondering if it was his place to ask. Finally, he mustered the courage. "Is everything okay?" Martin rubbed the back of his neck. "My ex-wife Gina called to let me know she's selling the house we shared. She wants me to come by and sign some paperwork." He hesitated, then added softly, "It's also the house Tyler grew up in." Nick's throat tightened. He knew how Martin felt about that topic. "I'm sorry," he offered gently. Martin's gaze flicked over him, thoughtful. "Sometimes letting go is the hardest part," he said quietly, as though speaking to both of them. Nick felt a pang, remembering his own runaway. He had physically left home, but his mind still wrestled with the hurt. They worked in an unspoken tension that day. Martin seemed distracted, misplacing tools and nearly overfilling a varnish cup. Nick, wanting to help, took the initiative to handle tasks by himself. He applied sanding sealer to a half-finished wardrobe and, to his surprise, felt a sense of competence rising in him. For once, he didn't feel worthless. Just as dusk settled as Nick was cleaning the brushes, Martin spoke up. "Hey, Nick. I have to go out of town for a few days. Deal with that paperwork and some memories. Workshop will be closed. Wonder if you'd like to come with me." Nick turned, startled. "With you? Are you sure?" Martin shrugged. "I could use the company, honestly. And he paused, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't want you out on the street while I'm gone." Nick's eyes warmed with gratitude but also anxiety. Traveling meant stepping outside their safe bubble. "I don't want to impose," he began. "It's not an imposition," Martin insisted. "If you feel comfortable, that is. Otherwise, I'll leave you some money for a motel here, but I guess I'd rather not do that. Worried about you, kid." Kid. The word stung with affection Nick wasn't. They set off the next morning in Martin's battered old pickup truck, the sun just crawling over the rooftops. The autumn wind was chilly, rustling leaves that danced across the pavement. Nick watched the streets blur into highways, then rural roads. For a while, Martin was quiet, focusing on the road. Nick didn't mind. He was captivated by the rolling scenery fields dipped in amber, trees painted in reds and golds. It was a sharp contrast to the gray bustle of the city. Late that afternoon, they arrived in a small town with cozy-looking houses, a main street lined with antique shops, and a historic courthouse in the center. Martin pointed to a modest white house on a corner lot. "That's where Tyler grew up," he said, voice tight. "And where he spent his last days." Nick's pulse fluttered. He wasn't sure how to offer comfort except to gently lay a hand on Martin's shoulder. Martin seemed to appreciate the gesture, even if he didn't speak. They pulled into the driveway, and Martin shut off the engine. Silence thickened between them as the house loomed. A single-story structure with a small porch, peeling paint on the shutters. Memories must have swelled in Martin's mind. "I'll just wait here," Nick offered quietly. Martin shook his head, forced a wan smile. Come in with me. I'll give you the short tour, then we'll head to a motel. Gina's not here yet, so we've got time." Nick followed Martin inside. The rooms were half empty, boxes stacked in corners. Dust motes danced in the dim light from curtains that were drawn shut. Martin walked slowly, like he was stepping over shards of broken glass. He pointed out the living room, the worn couch where Tyler had once sprawled out playing video games. The kitchen, with drawings of crayon flowers, still stuck to the fridge by ancient magnets. Then they climbed a short hallway to a closed door. "Tyler's room," Martin murmured. He hesitated, hand trembling on the doorknob. Nick's heart pounded with empathy. Eventually, Martin opened it. The room smelled stale, the bed stripped of sheets. Posters of sports cars and rock bands still clung to the walls. Nick could nearly see a younger Martin standing there, a teenage Tyler engrossed in homework or strumming an out-of-tune guitar. After the accident, Martin trailed off, clearing his throat. He was only 14. Nick lowered his gaze, sadness blooming in his chest. He thought of his own mother's passing, how abrupt life could be. He wanted to say something comforting, but the words got lost. Instead, he rested a hand on Martin's arm. "I'm sorry," Nick whispered. He must have been a great kid." Martin swallowed hard. He was. A long silence stretched. Then they slowly backed out, leaving the ghost of Tyler's memories behind. They locked up the house and drove to a small motel near the town center, where Martin rented a room with 2 beds. The fluorescent motel sign buzzed in the twilight. Later, as darkness fell, they both sat on separate beds, the dim lamp between them. Martin sighed. "Thanks for coming, Nick. I know this must be strange." Nick looked down at his hands. He hesitated, but the story he'd kept buried began to rise in his throat. "I ran away from home," he confessed. "It wasn't. I wasn't some kid who wanted adventure. My daddy was bad. After my mom died, he changed. I couldn't stay there anymore." Martin nodded, as though he had already suspected. "I figured it was something like that." Nick's eyes stung. "I didn't know how to survive. I thought maybe I'd find a better life in the city. But it was scary. Then you showed up and gave a chance." Martin's voice was gentle. "I'm glad I did." That night, Nick hardly slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Martin's pain and his own, about how they were both haunted by the families they'd lost in different ways. And yet, they had somehow found each other. A faint swirl of hope fluttered in Nick's chest, warming him. The next day, Gina arrived for the paperwork. Martin asked Nick to wait outside in the truck while he spoke with her, not wanting to drag Nick into the tension. From the passenger seat, Nick watched through the window as Martin and Gina stood on the porch, gesturing, exchanging documents. Their faces were grim, but no angry words were audible. Eventually, Gina left in her car. Martin returned, face drawn with exhaustion. He settled into the driver's seat, resting his hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. "I signed the papers," he said quietly. "She'll sell the house next month." Nick could only nod. He knew Martin's heart must be breaking, letting go of the last piece of Tyler's home. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "No," Martin admitted, eyes glistening. "But it's time to move on." He swallowed hard, then turned to Nick. "You know, Nick, I can't replace Tyler," and tears threatened to spill from Nick's eyes. He reached for Martin's hand, the gesture bridging the quiet distance. In that moment, Nick understood that they were no longer just employer and helper. They were 2 broken people trying to heal together, forging an unlikely bond where each found a glimmer of family in the other. Ending. They left town that afternoon. As they neared the city, Martin glanced at Nick, who was dozing against the window, still wearing the same threadbare jacket. A determined look settled on Martin's face, and he turned off the highway onto a smaller road lined with discount clothing stores and small businesses. Nick stirred awake when the truck stopped. "Where are we?" Martin offered a half smile. "I figured we could pick up some warmer clothes before winter sets in. My treat." Nick opened his mouth to protest the hated feeling like a charity case, but Martin cut him off with a raised hand. "It's just a gift, Nick, nothing more. You've earned it. You've worked hard at the shop, and your dedication keeps me going, too." Nick exhaled, a wave of gratitude washing through him. "All right," he murmured, voice trembling slightly. They headed into a discount store, walking aisles crowded with sweaters and jackets. Martin insisted Nick find something durable, something that fit properly. Nick felt self-conscious, but Martin gently encouraged him to try on a sturdy coat lined with fleece. When Nick finally stood in front of a mirror, arms engulfed in warm sleeves, he felt oddly comforted. It was just a piece of clothing, but it symbolized so much more: a new beginning, a small step toward a life where he was cared for. When they returned to the truck, Martin looked thoughtful. "Nick, have you thought about going back to school, or maybe a GED program?" Nick stiffened, old insecurities flaring. I didn't do well in school after my mom passed. My dad didn't care if I went or not. 2. Don't know if I could handle it." Martin turned the key in the ignition, letting the engine idle. "You're smart, Nick. I see it in how quickly you've picked up woodworking, how you ask questions, how you can fix problems I didn't even see. You could do well if you had a little support." Nick swallowed hard, staring at his hands in his lap. "Maybe," he whispered. Part of him yearned for the stability of education, the chance to do something more. But he was afraid of failing, afraid of not belonging, afraid that the kindness Martin offered was temporary. "I guess I'll think about it." Martin started driving. "That's all I ask," he said softly. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm more peaceful than any Nick had known in years. Martin continued to teach him the craft of woodworking, showing him how to carefully measure and cut boards, how to use chisels and mallets, and how to apply the perfect coat of lacquer. Nick learned to admire the slow, methodical process of taking rough lumber and shaping it into something beautiful. During breaks, they'd talk about Tyler or Nick's mother. They'd laugh at small jokes. Martin taught Nick how to cook simple meals on the hot plate in the workshop's back room. Nick's hunger pangs became a distant memory. There were still difficult nights when Nick woke from nightmares of his father's rage, heart pounding in terror. But Martin was there with a calm presence, reminding him he was safe. One crisp evening, Martin was locking up the workshop when Nick hesitated. "Can I talk to you?" Martin nodded, concern flickering in his gaze. "Of course." Nick fiddled with the hem of his new coat. "I've been thinking about the GED classes you mentioned. I might want to try." A wide smile lit Martin's face. "That's wonderful, Nick. I can help you find a program nearby. And I'll be here for whatever you need. Promise." Tears pricked Nick's eyes at the unspoken warmth in Martin's words. He couldn't remember the last time someone was proud of him or encouraged him so freely. "Thank you," he whispered. That moment set a new course for Nick's life. With Martin's help, he enrolled in evening GED preparation classes at a local adult education center. The first night, Nick trembled with nerves as he stepped into a room of strangers, some older, some younger, but all there to learn. He took a seat near the back, heart fluttering. Over the course of the lesson, though, he began to relax. The instructor was patient, the other students kind. Nick realized he wasn't alone in wanting a second chance. Weeks turned into months. Between morning shifts at the workshop and evening classes, Nick's schedule brimmed with purpose. Martin cheered, each small Victoria test passed, a tricky algebra concept finally clicking into place. They still had struggles. Money wasn't plentiful, and Martin occasionally argued with old clients about custom furniture orders, sometimes complaining about the slow market. But they faced these challenges together. When Nick found part-time odd jobs on the weekends, he pooled some of his earnings to buy groceries for the workshop. Martin acted exasperated but secretly proud each time Nick insisted on sharing. Then, one cold winter night, everything came to a head. Nick was locking up the workshop alone. Martin had gone to pick up a special type of stain from a supplier and, as he stepped out into the alley, he froze. His father was standing there, leaning against the wall. Nick's stomach dropped. He felt numb, fear flooding his veins. "Dad?" he managed, voice shaking. His father looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot, the smell of alcohol thick around him. "I finally found you," he slurred, pushing off the wall. "You think you can just run off and not pay for it?" Nick's mind reeled. How did he find me? The city was big, but maybe he had asked around or recognized Nick from someone's description. Nick backed away, fumbling for his keys to retreat inside the workshop. But his father grabbed his arm, knuckles white with anger. "Let me go," Nick hissed, panic rising. "You're coming home," his father snarled, breath reeking of whiskey. "You think I'm going to let you shame me by wandering homeless? You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," Nick snapped, anger and terror colliding. He twisted, trying to yank free. All the memories of abuse and shouting matches came flooding back. His father raised a hand, as if to strike him. Nick braced himself, heart hammering, when suddenly a bright beam of headlights swept into the alley. Martin's truck screeched to a stop, the door flying open. "Get away from him!" Martin's voice thundered across the cold night. Nick's father blinked in the sudden light, momentarily disoriented. Nick wrenched his arm free and stumbled toward Martin, whose face blazed with protective fury. Martin positioned himself between Nick and his father. "You have no business here," Martin barked, fists clenched. He was taller than Nick's father, broad-shouldered, a formidable presence. Nick's father scoffed, swaying slightly, but some of his bravado wavered. "That's my boy. Who do you think you are?" Martin's glare was ice. "Someone who cares more about him than you ever did," he spat. "If you so much as lay a finger on Nick, I'll call the police. Understood?" Nick's father bared his teeth in a sneer, but the fight had drained from him. He looked at Nick, eyes filled with toxic resentment. Then he turned and shuffled down the alley, muttering curses under his breath until he disappeared into the dark. Nick stood there, trembling. Martin turned and pulled him into a firm embrace. Nick's breath hitched, hot tears spilling down his cheeks as relief and terror warred in his chest. "It's okay," Martin murmured, holding him tight. "He can't hurt you anymore, I promise." They stood like that for a long moment until Nick finally calmed. His tears slowed, leaving him exhausted but oddly lighter. That confrontation had felt like crossing a final threshold, standing up to the specter of his father, with Martin's fierce support. They locked the workshop doors and drove home in silence. Once inside, Nick sank onto the old couch in the back office, shoulders still trembling with adrenaline. Martin sat next to him, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Martin asked softly. Nick managed a shaky nod. "Yes, too. Sorry you had to see that." Martin shook his head, eyes rimmed with concern. "Don't ever apologize. None of that was your fault." He paused, then added, "Nick, I want you to know you have a place here as long as you want it. You don't have to keep running." Tears welled again in Nick's eyes. He heard the unspoken offer, the open door into a life where he was cared for. "To want to stay," he whispered. "I want to finish my GED, and keep working, and maybe eventually get my own place, but I don't want to lose what we have here." Martin's face softened with something that looked like both relief and affection. "You won't lose it," he promised. "We'll figure it out together." In the spring, Nick passed his GED exams. Martin took him out for burgers and milkshakes in celebration, beaming from ear to ear. The certificate felt unreal in Nick's hands, a tangible symbol of his transformation from a frightened runaway into a young man with a future. At the diner, Martin teased him about continuing on to community college, and for the first time, Nick didn't dismiss the idea. He actually imagined himself in a classroom, pursuing a career, maybe something related. Later that week, they were at the workshop finishing a custom set of chairs for a local restaurant. Nick carefully buffed the final coat of wax, admiring the warm sheen on the wood. He breathed in the scent, a mix of pine resin and beeswax. Martin stood beside him, handing him a clean cloth. "You've become quite the craftsman," Martin remarked, pride evident in his tone. Nick smiled, meeting Martin's gaze. "Thanks. For everything." Martin studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on Nick's shoulder. "You know, I was thinking we might expand the shop a bit. Start offering some classes, teach people the basics of woodworking. You'd be good at helping me with that." Nick felt a burst of excitement. "Really? You think so?" "I do," Martin replied, sincerity shining in his eyes. "It'd be a way to bring more life into this place, and maybe we can show others how creating something can help you heal." Nick nodded, heart swelling. He flashed back to the first day he'd stepped into this workshop, cold, hungry, and alone. Now his body and spirit were stronger. He finally had a sense of home, not defined by blood relatives, but by the warmth of shared grief, hope, and kindness. A year later, the workshop bustled with activity. New shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies for woodworking classes that met on Saturday mornings. Martin and Nick worked side by side, instructing newcomers on how to handle saws safely, how to sand properly, and how to apply finishes with a steady hand. The hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter filled the space where silence and despair once reigned. Nick was 20 pounds heavier, a sign of no longer going hungry. His hair was neatly trimmed, and he sported a smile that reached his eyes. After passing his GED, he'd enrolled in a part-time course at the local community college, studying art and design while continuing to work with Martin. He discovered a passion for creative detail, hand-carving flourishes into tabletops or shaping unique chairbacks. Martin seemed lighter, too. He'd hung a small photo of Tyler on the workshop wall, but this time it faced outward in a modest frame, no longer hidden. When asked, Martin would speak fondly of his son. The bitter edge of grief had softened, replaced by a gentle remembrance. Nick's presence had reignited Martin's sense of purpose. Instead of carrying sorrow alone, Martin channeled his love for Tyler into mentorship, fatherly guidance for a boy who needed it more than anything. One Saturday afternoon, they closed early, having finished their class session. Nick and Martin sat in the office, sipping lukewarm coffee. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Nick broke the companionable silence. "Martin, there's something I've been meaning to say." Martin arched an eyebrow. "Yes?" "Thank you," Nick murmured, voice steady despite the emotion rising in his chest. "You saved me from a life that I don't know where it would have led. You gave me a home, a job, an education. You gave me a family in a way." Martin set down his coffee cup, eyes glistening. "You gave me a family too," he said, voice thick with emotion. "After Tyler, I never thought I could feel this sort of connection again." He squeezed Nick's shoulder. "But you proved me wrong." Nick felt tears warm his eyes. "I just wish my mom could see this. She'd want to thank you for taking care of me, for showing me that people can still bind." Martin smiled through his own tears. "Maybe she does see it, wherever she is. And I think Tyler sees it too." They sat in the golden light, letting the moment of quiet understanding envelop them. In the past, both had faced heartbreak, Nick losing his mother and suffering his father's abuse, Martin losing Tyler in a tragic accident. But there, in that workshop, they found each other. They discovered that family isn't always defined by blood ties. Sometimes it's formed. Epilogue. Years later, the sign above the door no longer read, just Langley's Workshop. It had been updated, carved by Nick himself to say, Langley and Dawson Woodcraft, a tribute to the partnership they'd forged. In the back office, a row of photographs told the story of their journey. Martin and Nick grinning over a freshly finished table, Nick clutching his GED certificate, a group photo of their first woodworking class. At the center of it all hung two small, beloved pictures. Tyler, smiling with Martin, and Nick's mother, beaming with Nick on her lap in happier times. From runaway to protege, from lonely craftsman to father figure, they had each found shelter in one another's hearts. And though the world beyond those workshop doors remained a place of unknowns, they had built a haven of warmth, resilience, and love. The scars of their pasts would never fully vanish, but they had learned to carry them with grace. In the soft scratch of sandpaper on wood, in the smell of varnish, in the gentle hush of late nights spent designing new creations, they found solace and hope. In the end, Nick's life changed not through some grand, miraculous event, but through the simple, persistent kindness of one man who refused to see him as a lost cause. Martin's life changed just as profoundly, renewed by the faith and trust of a boy who needed a safe place to belong. They healed each other's wounds in a slow and steady way, day by day, plank by plank, until the empty spaces in their hearts were filled with a family of their own making. And that, they both understood, was the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes love comes in the shape of a helping hand and a warm meal and a promise to stand by someone, even when the rest of the world turns away. They showed that when loneliness meets compassion, it can forge bonds stronger than blood. It can transform a runaway boy into a hopeful young man and a grieving father into a mentor and friend. It can light the darkness of an empty workshop and make it a home. In that quiet glow of mutual understanding, Nick and Martin built something far sturdier than furniture.